Good afternoon. Masks off and welcome to St. George's. We've got an interesting day for you today, and we're delighted that you're here. We are going to share the podium and the audience with the Episcopal School of Nashville third graders who are studying Andrew Jackson. And it's good, and it's good for us to think about Andrew Jackson. So I want to introduce you to Harrison Stewart, the retiring head of School of the Episcopal of Nashville. Harrison has taken a position at a much larger Episcopal school in Greensboro, North Carolina, and will be leaving the 30th of June. We want to thank him for what he has brought to this community. He has founded a school that is now 5 years old, and we will continue in strong measure after he departs, as we are now. So, Harrison, would you come up, please, sir?
Thank you, Sewell, and thank you, friends. This is not the school I've founded, Sewell. We've founded this. All of this entire Nashville community that was so interested 6 and 7 years ago in this Episcopal school startup. In so many of my conversations, I just remember how many different committees and opportunities we've all shared in to celebrate the birth of this school. And I know everyone will continue to support it to the best of their abilities, including my family, which has entered into another 5-year pledge to support our Build Our Nest campaign, which is off to a terrific start. It is a special day, and as always, St. George's has meant so much to our community, our growing school community, and it's really fun that it's our third grade today. And I hope that Annette Pilcher is tuning in, because it was Annette's idea when Sewell and I met with her about our archives just last week, that her grandson in our third grade class, Amos Pilcher, was full of stories about the Trail of Tears, about Andrew Jackson, and just had a curious and exciting conversation with her. And it just so happened that Sewell mentioned you all have a wonderfully relevant speaker today. And so amongst you in spirit and character are the children from the third grade at Episcopal School with their wonderful teacher, Ms. Mall. And I know they're going to enjoy this program very much. But thank you, Sewell. Thank you for your kind words. Thanks to St. George's for all your support. I look forward to seeing everybody in person soon enough and giving you an elbow bump. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Harrison. He represents the spirit we try to portray in the school, where every child is special and every child has an opportunity to grow and mature spiritually, academically, and physically. So thanks, Harrison, and God go with you.
God bless you, Sewell.
All right. And now to welcome us again and to pray over our endeavors is the Reverend David Barr. David?
Good morning, everyone. The Lord be with you. Let's pray. Lord, we do pray that we might learn from leaders in our country who have endeavored to do great things. We ask, Lord, that you would be with young people watching right now, that they might be given a deep desire to learn more from the past. Lord, we're grateful that you gather us in your name. We're grateful to have people teach us about things that we would otherwise never get to hear. So, Father, we do pray that we would learn wisdom from presidents as great as we've had in this state. And we pray all of this in the name of Jesus. Amen. Thank you.
Good morning. Again, a couple of quick announcements. Our May presentation will be by Tamara Smithers about the brand new opening in Nashville, National Museum of African American Music. So you will hear a good story and you'll hear some good music, and I think you'll want to go visit. So that will be the third Thursday in May at 12 o'clock. A couple of other announcements. We are back in session at St. George's, and when you come back, please wear your name tags. It is so hard to see people without a nose and a mouth. They're not as recognizable as you might think they are. At least they're not for me, so please wear your name tag. Continue to make your reservations for the services, but the 5 o'clock on Sunday is outdoors now, and we now have morning worship 5 days a week at 7 a.m. in the chapel. Reservations not needed. So we're beginning to come back, and there'll be many more announcements coming forth. I want to welcome today Art Baker. He's a year late because we were going to do this last April, and COVID really closed things down, if you can remember back to last April. So Art is back with us again. Last year he was going to have ladies in hoop skirts and costume to come with us and have lunch with us, and there's no lunch now either still. So we're in the process of coming back. But the Hermitage is celebrating this year, and Art's going to talk about it and talk about the importance of Andrew Jackson in our lives and in our lives in Middle Tennessee today. So Art, come on up, please. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Sewell. It is an honor to be here today at St. George's. My title is Vice President of Development for the Andrew Jackson Foundation. So my primary focus right now is fundraising, and as you can imagine, there has been a lot of focus on that this year. Like a lot of other nonprofit organizations and tourism industries across Nashville, the impact of COVID-19 on our different earned revenue channels has been dramatic. We are beginning to see some very positive results as vaccination rates increase and as things begin to open back up across Metro. But in the meantime, we have had to depend on the generosity of many of our stakeholders. We've had a lot of people step up in a big way. And so it's been an exciting year. But really, no matter what your role is at the Hermitage, you really become very captivated by the history of the site. Whether it's fundraising or marketing, the interpretive team, we all share a mission in knowing as much as we can and sharing as much as we can about the history of the Hermitage. And that's why I'm especially excited to be here today. It's also an honor to have the Episcopal School of Nashville with us today, the third grade class. I was mentioning to Sewell before the presentation started, we have about 35,000 young people who visit the Hermitage every year, and a sizable percentage of that group is made up of fourth grade field trips. And so this really is the perfect time to be hearing a lot of these stories about our seventh president. He also mentioned that you're tackling some of the controversies about Jackson. We'll touch on that today as well. There really are a number of fascinating stories about President Andrew Jackson. I did have the opportunity to attend a primetime luncheon back in 2019. As Sewell mentioned, I was supposed to be here about a year ago. And so it was interesting, almost a year later, to go back and review what I had been working on when the pandemic took full force and everything began to shut down. Because I think the topic that I had picked then is more relevant now than it would have been back in 2020. The focus of our time together today is the importance of home. And it's about a side of Andrew Jackson that perhaps you've not heard as much about. And I think it's appropriate that we have this conversation now in 2021 as the Hermitage celebrates the 200th anniversary of the Jacksons moving into the Hermitage Mansion. Not to mention, we have all spent more time at home in the last year than we have at probably any other point in our lives. And so I think it's a good reminder of the importance of place and also the importance of family, especially in times of crisis or great transition. So with that in mind, our presentation today is entitled, My Choice is the Hermitage. And I want to take you back to the year 1830. President Andrew Jackson pens a letter from Washington to Adam Huntsman, a fellow Tennessee lawyer and politician. It is a somewhat tumultuous time for the Jackson administration. He has been accused by the National Journal of abusing his power and taking advantage of his frank. His frank is his power as president to send postage through to send mail without using postage. And they said that he was doing this by publishing articles in the Washington Globe and sending out copies. So the Globe was, let's call it, a lightly biased news source. Not uncommon at the time, nor is it now, for different news outlets to favor a certain party or candidate, but Jackson contended that he was simply using the publication to speak freely, and it was his mouthpiece to communicate with the American people. It is certainly true that Jackson was a proponent of printed news. If you were to visit the Hermitage Mansion today and look inside of his library, you would see enormous bound volumes all across the floor. They're comprised of nothing but newspapers. In his retirement, he subscribed to upwards of 15 different newspapers from around the country. If you were to open up the volumes, you would see his scribbled notes in the margins. In some cases, you would see giant X's marked through entire articles with which he disagreed. Even in retirement, Jackson had a pulse on the nation. And so, citing this passion for the press, he writes Adam Huntsman in 1830, and he asks him to scrutinize the message and tell him if he is, in fact, acting inappropriately. He says, "I send you my message published in the Globe. Read the message and let me have your strictures freely upon it. You see, I have spoken freely as I ought. Let the people judge. If my opinions are not congenial with the true Republican faith, let the people determine it. The Hermitage is my choice. Yours, Andrew Jackson." Huntsman takes Jackson's side, and he publishes this message in the Globe to prove the accusations that he was abusing his rank as president to be false. Now, this story is a blip on the radar of Jackson's life and his administration, but the sentiments contained in that message to Adam Huntsman are paramount if we really want to understand Old Hickory. First, and probably not surprisingly, he expresses complete confidence in what he's doing and his motivations for doing it. No matter what you may think about Jackson, he was, if nothing else, a man of complete conviction. Really a prerequisite to be a successful businessman, general, and politician in the early 19th century. Second, he believes that the will of the people should ultimately prevail. Jackson was a fierce proponent of democratic expansion, especially after the election of 1824, where he won the popular vote, but failed to capture a majority and then lost the election in the House of Representatives. Now, he believed that a corrupt bargain had been struck to deny him the presidency and to deny the voice of the people. So between the elections of 1824 and 1828, when Jackson was eventually elected to his first term in office, voter turnout increased dramatically, primarily because of legislation that affected who was eligible to vote. And so Jackson, the first president to hail from any state other than Virginia or Massachusetts, and certainly the first president of such humble beginnings to rise to the nation's highest office, was considered the people's president. Not only for these reasons, but also because he was ardent in his belief that the people, not Congress, not the aristocracy, not special interests, but the people should determine who sits in the White House. And it was his conviction in this idea that ultimately transformed the office of the presidency into an institution that we would recognize today, and it would ultimately level the branches of government. Dr. Dan Feller is a historian. He's the editor of the Papers of Andrew Jackson. He is a professor at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. He points to this idea about Jackson when he says Jackson was able to transform his Jacksonian personal majority into a bound and disciplined political party. Because the Democratic Party was not a party, they were the people themselves. It's not our party against their party, it's the people organized against the aristocracy. Jackson's election completely upended America's political norms, and it began to shape our democracy into something more closely resembling our political process of today. So in this letter, Jackson first articulates his conviction in what he's doing. Second, he articulates his belief in the power of the people. And finally, the third sentiment, and this will be the one that's really central to our time together today, Jackson expresses his preference for home. The Hermitage is my choice. Let the people decide, but I choose the Hermitage. The Hermitage was incredibly precious to Jackson, as indicated by the name he gave it. Hermitage is derived from the French for retreat or refuge. And his love affair with the estate began all the way back in 1804 when he purchased the first 425 acres from Nathaniel Hayes for $3,400. Now, the mansion you see today was more than 30 years in the making. In fact, for the first 17 years that the Jacksons occupied the property, they lived in a log farmhouse, something that we call the First Hermitage. And the second story of that building is still on the property today, just 300 yards north of the mansion. I do want to be clear that it was not a frontier farmhouse in the traditional sense. It was not very rugged, as you might imagine. The outside of the structure was covered in clapboard. The inside walls were lined with fine French wallpaper, furnishings imported from Philadelphia, and a steady stream of very prominent guests, people like Aaron Burr, President James Monroe. Jackson, at this point, had already begun his ascent into politics and the public eye. He had served as a lawyer, a Superior Court judge, a congressman, general of the Tennessee militia, and a strong proponent and key figure in drafting Tennessee's Constitution ahead of statehood in 1796. So construction doesn't begin on the first version of the Hermitage Mansion until 1819. And at this point, Jackson's a major general in the U.S. Army. He's the hero of the Battle of New Orleans. And just 2 years later, in 1821, the family moves into a brick, federal-style home with 2 stories, 8 rooms, and 2 wide center halls. It was a symmetrical style of architecture that was very popular at the time, and this version of the house would serve as the foundation for later versions of the mansion. It was modest when compared to today's final version of Jackson's home, but it was still a significant upgrade over the log farmhouse they'd inhabited for the previous 17 years, fashionable though it was. This new mansion boasted 2 parlors, a basement summer kitchen, 9 fireplaces, French wallpaper, metal gutters, and later a portico. Now, at the time, remember, the average Tennessean would have been living in a home that was roughly 400 square feet. That was the size of one of the Jackson's parlors, and that would have been without the 14-foot ceilings. So this was a mammoth project. Interestingly, the only known image of the mansion in its original form is in the background of a painting. The painting is entitled Tennessee Gentleman. It was produced by Ralph E.W. Earl, Jackson's preferred portraitist, and is part of our collection at the Hermitage. But if you look in the background, and I'll zoom in on this photo, you can see that what we're talking about is a very different home from the mansion you would see on site today. You see the simple federal-style brick structure with just the 2 stories. But as Jackson grew in popularity and influence, it seemed like the mansion just continued to grow with him. In 1831, under the oversight of architect David Morrison, the house underwent a major renovation. 2 single-story wings were added to the east and west side of the mansion. The front portico was expanded with 10 Doric columns added, a small rear portico, copper gutters. All of this was added to the mansion to give it a more classical appearance. The west wing housed a large dining room that spanned the entire width of the house, along with a pantry, and the east wing, really what our CEO often refers to as the beating heart of the house. That is where Jackson's library was located, along with the farm office. In addition to all of the work inside the house, there was a smokehouse and a semi-detached kitchen added to the back of the now 13-room mansion. Once again, this is kind of the theme. There's only one known version of this image of the mansion, and it's on the border of a period map of Nashville that has some of the city's most prominent buildings along the edge. This map hangs, actually a copy of this map hangs in the hallway of the mansion outside of Jackson's library, and you can see that it's not quite to scale. They managed to pull in the tomb from the southeast corner of the garden. But once again, both of these versions of the house, the one completed in 1821 and the one expanded in 1831, we only have a couple of images, and they just happen to show up in very unexpected places. One reason that you may not see many depictions of the second version of the mansion is because it just didn't last very long. Because in 1834, disaster struck the Hermitage Mansion. An ember from the chimney ignited the wood-shingled roof of the mansion, and it created a huge fire that had a devastating effect on the interior and exterior of the mansion. But the mansion that emerged from this crisis was the most impressive and enduring of any of Jackson's homes. And this is the version of the house that more than 17 million visitors from around the world have visited since the Hermitage opened as a public museum in 1889. This restoration that took place after the fire from 1834 to 1837, it shaped the mansion into its modern-day appearance, that of a temple in the Greek Revival style of architecture. The front facade was transformed by 6 two-story columns with modified Corinthian capitals. Similar columns were placed on the back of the house. The brick and the columns on the mansion's front were painted to resemble the appearance and texture of stone. If you were to go inside the house, you would find more Greek Revival style architecture in the woodwork and the mantels added to public spaces. And then what I consider the most impressive feature on the inside of the mansion, a flying cantilevered staircase added to the center hall. Now, Jackson was managing this restoration project from Washington, and there was one part of the project that he would not compromise on: the wallpaper in the center hall of the mansion. It was a fine French wallpaper that depicted the story of Telemachus, the story taken from Homer's The Odyssey. It had been selected by his wife Rachel, who had passed away a few years earlier in 1828, just before Jackson left for Washington for his first term as president. So, with the wallpaper intact, with the house restored in its most brilliant form yet, Jackson now commanded the most fashionable, impressive house anywhere in Tennessee, possibly anywhere outside of the East Coast. It was one that reflected his status as the most prominent politician of the time. Today, more than 90% of the artifacts you see in the mansion are original to Jackson and his family, making the Hermitage the most well-preserved early presidential home in the United States. Original wallpaper, original furniture, family possessions, all of these things form the core of our collection that totals more than 800,000 pieces. Jackson spoke and wrote often about the Hermitage. It was meaningful to him for many reasons. It was the center of his many business enterprises. It was situated just far enough out of Nashville to serve as an escape from the spotlight of his political and military careers. It was a testament to his newly found power and influence. But most importantly, it's where he could be surrounded by his family, a luxury that he was not afforded in his childhood. It's where his wife, Rachel, was laid to rest after she passed in 1828, and it's where he would visit her tomb in the garden every evening when he was at the Hermitage. To understand Jackson's affinity for the Hermitage, to understand what it represented to him, we have to understand more about his origin. The larger-than-life figure that emerged from the Battle of New Orleans, a national hero, had really come from the most humble beginnings. Jackson's mother, father, and older brother all immigrate from Ireland in 1765, just 2 years before Andrew is to be born. His father, for whom he's named, dies just 2 weeks before his birth, and he's raised by his mother, Elizabeth, in the Waxhaw settlement that's located just along the border of modern-day North and South Carolina. The Revolution breaks out in 1776, and it reaches their doorstep in 1778. And for the next 3 years, it rages in this particular section of the Carolinas, and it has a devastating impact on Jackson's life. Steve Inskeep, he's the host of NPR's Morning Edition. He points out Andrew Jackson grew up and came of age in an era of chaos. When he was very young, the Revolutionary War broke out. It was bitterly fought in this area on the border between North and South Carolina. So Andrew, along with his brothers, volunteers to join the revolution and fight the British. Jackson is just 13 years old at this point. His oldest brother, Hugh, dies of a heat stroke after the Battle of Stono Ferry in 1779. In 1781, Jackson and his brother Robert are captured by the British and become prisoners of war. To this day, Jackson is our only president to have served as a POW. Famously, during his captivity, a British officer slashes Jackson with a sword for refusing to polish his boots. Later, still in captivity, both Andrew and Robert contract a severe case of smallpox. And so out of this illness, Elizabeth, their mother, is able to arrange for their release via a prisoner exchange. Unfortunately, shortly after that release, Robert succumbs to the illness and dies. But Jackson recovers, and he travels with Elizabeth to Charleston. She's going there to aid the war effort by tending to sick and injured soldiers. But in 1781, she contracts cholera, and she dies as well, leaving Jackson as an orphan at just 14 years old. Inskeep goes on to say, it was an extremely brutal time of social dislocation, and this was Andrew Jackson's youth. He then moved west to Tennessee in the 1780s to start a life for himself. He was to become Tennessee's first member of Congress, a Tennessee senator, a judge, a victorious general who won one of the most important military victories in the history of the United States, the Battle of New Orleans, and finally, President of the United States. No one had ever climbed a ladder like that. It's not clear to me people even knew such a ladder existed before Andrew Jackson. The chaos and tragedy that shaped Jackson's childhood and youth made his meteoric rise all the more stunning. But it also made his relationship with Rachel and her close-knit family, the Donaldsons, incredibly meaningful to him. He met Rachel in 1788 while boarding with her mother in Nashville, and it was love at first sight. Their relationship was legally a bit precarious at first. Maybe that's a story for next time, Sewell. But the joining of Jackson, a rising star, and the powerful Donaldson family who helped found the city of Nashville, it was a powerful alliance and one that would be influential in American politics for decades to follow. But more importantly for Jackson, it offered him stability. Being around Rachel and her family was really the first time since he was orphaned at 14 that he could be surrounded by his own immediate family. So in 1791, for the first time, they marry, and they live in the Nashville area. Eventually, they buy a farm, Poplar Grove, and they reside there from 1792 to 1796. From there, they upgrade to a 640-acre farm situated just on the Cumberland River called Hunter's Hill. Throughout this time, Jackson continues to practice law, and he's taking on a number of business endeavors, including land speculation, a general store, and some other joint ventures. One of these ventures fails miserably, and Jackson is forced to sell Hunter's Hill in order to avoid declaring bankruptcy. And so, on July 5th, 1804, having just sold off the Hunter's Hill property, he purchases a smaller property from his neighbor, Nathaniel Hayes, the first 425 acres of the farm that would become known as the Hermitage. The Hermitage, after he purchased it, continued to grow under Jackson's oversight, and today, the Andrew Jackson Foundation owns and operates 1,120 acres that were held by Jackson in his lifetime. Jackson died on June 8, 1845. And the farm was then left to his son, Andrew Jackson Jr. Jr. Did not possess President Jackson's business prowess or even his interest in running the farm. And so just 11 years later, Jr. declares bankruptcy. And that paves the way for the state of Tennessee to acquire a large portion of the Hermitage property, including all of its key assets. And so when you fast forward to 1889, this is when the Ladies Hermitage Association, what is now the Andrew Jackson Foundation, was founded and deeded the core 25 acres of the property, including the mansion and the tomb and Rachel's garden. And looking back, it was ultimately Andrew Jackson Jr.'s poor management of the farm and the state's subsequent purchase of the core piece of the Hermitage property that led to the foundation's ability to so accurately preserve the home of our seventh president. For the last 132 years, the Andrew Jackson Foundation has operated with the mission to preserve, educate, and inspire. The Hermitage remains an important part of American history if we want to understand the evolution of democracy and the presidency and Jackson himself. The mansion, the garden, the more than 1,100 acres that surround them, they truly are Tennessee treasures. And I want to invite you to visit for the first time if you've not been before, or to come back and experience all that it has to offer and teach. Many of our visitors begin with an introductory film entitled Jackson, and that's often followed by a tour of our award-winning exhibit, Born for a Storm, and then the Presidential Gallery that discusses Jackson's time in office. And I'm pleased to share that today you'll have the opportunity to view that video. And in fact, many of the quotes that I've shared with you today were pulled from that film. But before that, I don't want to leave today without saying this. The story of Andrew Jackson is important. His heroics and his flaws bear relevance and speak to our contemporary triumphs and struggles as a nation. Continuing to share the story of our seventh president in a fair and unbiased way remains at the center of our priorities. We don't shy away from Jackson. He was a consequential figure in American history who fought fiercely for his country. He won the popular vote for our nation's highest office in 3 consecutive elections. And he continues to have an impact on the way that we operate the political process in America today. But the Hermitage story is not just about Andrew Jackson, and it's not just about his family. Our mission to preserve and interpret Andrew Jackson's Hermitage extends beyond our namesake to the many families and individuals who lived and worked on the property. The stories of the enslaved community and the freedmen who remained after emancipation are woven into the fabric of this National Historic Landmark. And that's why this important part of our work remains active and has remained active even in the throes of this pandemic. Because for the last 40 years, we've conducted exhaustive research of the enslaved community. And for more than 20 years, it's been a focal point of our public-facing interpretive efforts. The Hermitage was one of the very first Southern historical sites to conduct original slavery archaeology. And we remain an active member of the DAACS, the Digital Archaeological Archive of Comparative Slavery. The stories that we've learned about over the last several decades about the enslaved community now figure prominently into every aspect of the site. Our guided audio tours, our interpretation, and most recently in our newest tour called In Their Footsteps, Lives of the Hermitage Enslaved. This is a 90-minute deep dive into the men and women who were enslaved at the Hermitage. It talks about the operation of the Hermitage Farm and the harsh realities of this system that existed. The efforts that the foundation has made to bring inclusivity to the story of Andrew Jackson, to tell the full story of the triumphs and tragedies that are tied to our seventh president, they've yielded some very positive results. Prior to COVID-19's arrival, the Hermitage was the third most visited presidential home in the U.S., behind George Washington's Mount Vernon and Thomas Jefferson's Monticello. We welcomed more than 235,000 guests annually, and within that number, as I mentioned before, about 35,000 young people who were there for family tours, child-focused events, and school field trips. We enjoyed excellent TripAdvisor ratings, growing attendance numbers, growing fundraising efforts, and we were also a key part of Nashville's booming and growing tourism industry. Jackson has received a lot of press in recent years. Concentrated efforts by the Andrew Jackson Foundation to reintroduce the full story of Andrew Jackson to the public, the affinity held for him by 45th President Donald Trump, who visited the Hermitage in 2017 and hung Jackson's portrait in the Oval Office, as well as a public that's just more mindful of the flaws of our political leaders past and present and the impact that has on society. All of these factors have contributed to a resurgence in the coverage of Jackson and new heated debate about how he should be remembered. In his own time, Andrew Jackson inspired fierce loyalty and intense disapproval, and the same is true today. I believe John Meacham, presidential historian and former AJF trustee, said it best: anyone who believes in democracy, anyone who believes in the future, has to grapple with Jackson. There is no avoiding Andrew Jackson in an honest study of American history. His victories were stunning, and his transgressions were dreadful, but both shaped the United States of America and continue to have an impact on our nation. And so for that reason, the story of Andrew Jackson is worth telling. It must be told. And so also must the stories of all the others who called the Hermitage home. Andrew Jackson chose the Hermitage. It was his home. And it was the embodiment of the story of a boy who was born into poverty and chaos and ascended to the highest point in our nation. After the year we've just had, I hope that we can all enjoy a renewed appreciation for home. And I hope that it can help us understand our seventh president just a little bit better. Thank you for your time, and enjoy the video.
Andrew Jackson grew up and came of age in an era of chaos. When he was very young, the Revolutionary War broke out. It was bitterly fought in his area on the border between North and South Carolina.
He lost his mother and his brothers during the Revolutionary War. He'd never known his father.
It was an extremely brutal time of social dislocation, and this was Andrew Jackson's youth.
He had to make his way alone in the world afterwards.
He then moved west to Tennessee in the 1780s to start a life for himself.
His aspirations were the aspirations of what could be considered the American dream.
He rose to become Tennessee's first member of Congress, a Tennessee senator, a judge, a victorious general who won one of the most important military victories in the history of the United States, the Battle of New Orleans, and finally President of the United States. No one had ever climbed a ladder like that. It's not clear to me that people even knew such a ladder existed before Andrew Jackson.
Jackson was totally contradictory. He could be incredibly sweet and incredibly ferocious.
He had a very violent streak, but when that streak was not keyed up, he presented himself as the most mild-mannered, polite gentleman you could imagine.
But that friendliness, that generosity, was always governed by Jackson's idea of his interest. If someone stood in the way of his financial interest or his idea of the nation's interest, he would stop at almost nothing to destroy them.
The affair between Andrew Jackson and Rachel Donaldson Robards was one totally of passion.
Rachel still had a husband living in Kentucky, and not everyone approved of the action that they had taken. Women who were in the Tennessee and Kentucky frontier were expected to be able to be more independent, to have more responsibility, and she took advantage of that to free herself from a marriage she wasn't happy with.
And so there was this great love, there was great utility as well, and ultimately it had an extraordinary impact on the conduct of his political career.
When Andrew Jackson and Rachel Donaldson formed their marriage in their early 20s, they didn't give any thought to how the extra-legal nature of their marriage would play out in Jackson's presidential ambitions.
That gave fodder to his political opponents forever, that Mrs. Jackson was a bigamist, that she had been married to two men at the same time.
Rachel was dreading moving to Washington City for his inauguration.
But his presidency began in tragedy.
I try to summon my usual fortitude, but it is in vain. My heart is nearly broke.
General, my condolences.
Colonel, you knew her well and respected her.
I did more than that. I had a sincere regard for her, and now consider her death a calamity.
I'm glad you are here.
Sir, there's a fight brewing. There's opposition to the appointment of John Eaton to Secretary of War.
I must have a man in whom I have complete confidence. We must fight this. This revives me. I was born for a storm. The calm does not suit me.
He believed that she had died out of sadness because of the attacks made on her by John Quincy Adams and his political opponents. It set him off on a path to Washington, feeling grief-stricken and furious.
Jackson believed that the aristocracy had embedded itself in American government and needed to be rooted out.
Jackson's hope for the country was that it would be more responsive to the will of the people, that the will of the majority was to prevail.
Jackson espoused what he called rotation in office, the idea that office holders, if they stay too long, become perhaps inefficient and corrupt.
Many of them were let go. It meant that people outside of a small circle had a chance to be part of government operations.
Many Americans, including political leaders, before Jackson's time were deeply conflicted on the question of party, on whether party was a good thing or a bad thing. President Jackson came increasingly to believe that party organization was the only way to ensure that the people would remain in power. Jackson was able to transform that Jacksonian personal majority into a bound and disciplined political party, because the Democratic Party was not a party, they were the people themselves. It's not our party against their party, it's the people organized against the aristocracy.
Jackson felt that the Bank of the United States had too much power.
There was a real question whether the bank was there to serve the interests of the government or whether it was there to serve the interests of the stockholders.
Jackson saw this as an inexcusable, corrupting force that if public money could be manipulated for private gain, then that way madness lay.
My object, sir, is to save the country, and it will be lost if we permit the bank to exist.
Nicholas Biddle was the president of the Bank of the United States. He was perfectly willing to engineer a panic in order to save the bank. He said all the banks in the country may break. Everything may break, but the Bank of the United States is not going to break. That's a dangerous man with a dangerous amount of power.
The Bank of the United States had a large group of friends. They introduced a bill in Congress to extend its charter for another 20 years. Jackson and his cabinet members wrote a veto message that was a smashing appeal to ordinary folks.
The powers conferred upon its agent not only unnecessary but dangerous to government and country.
Distinctions in society will always exist under every just government. Equality of talents, of education, or of wealth cannot be produced by human institutions. Every man is equally entitled to protection by the law. To make the rich richer and the potent more powerful, the humble members of society, the farmers, mechanics, and laborers, have a right to complain of the injustice of their government. There are no necessary evils in government. Its evils only exist in its abuses. If it would confine itself to equal protection and, as heaven does its rains, shower its favors alike on the high and the low, the rich and the poor, it would be an unqualified blessing. Good, sir.
He vetoed the bank. The message struck a chord in the country. Here was a president who was fighting for the common man versus the privileged man. Andrew Jackson embodies the best and the worst of America.
There are many important aspects of Andrew Jackson's legacy. Today, we often remember Indian removal and his support for African American slavery, and those things are true and they must be remembered.
Slave ownership was a part of the American dream for very many people, and he would have been the perfect exemplar of that. He was able to make himself into a wealthy man, into a prosperous man, and a powerful man through the slave system.
It is said that he treated his slaves kindly, but not so kindly as to free them.
There were people, even in Jackson's day, who were denouncing slavery as immoral, but he never thought anything about slavery as a fundamental moral question.
As a military leader, Andrew Jackson waged extraordinary numbers of campaigns against Native Americans.
The southeastern part of the United States, Georgia, southern Tennessee, North Carolina, it's a beautiful country, and especially once gold was discovered, the United States government wanted the Cherokees out. They wanted the land.
Indian removal not only was the policy of the nation, but had been the policy of the nation for some time before that. What was different about Jackson was that Jackson brought an urgency to the issue.
The Indian Removal Act was Jackson's first big legislative priority.
It wasn't just one roundup of Cherokees and one removal west. These are decades-long removals that are occurring of our native people from the southeast. Andrew Jackson is known as Jack the Devil by the Cherokee people.
To try to dismiss Jackson and remove him somehow from the American conversation because of his stance on slavery, because of his stance on Native Americans, is really to foreclose the possibility of learning from history.
History is messy, and we don't turn our eyes away just because they do things that we don't like to do. It's all a part of it. It's the bitter with the sweet, good with the bad, and there's certainly those measures in him.
The crisis of Jackson's presidency, you might say, came in 1832, 1833, when he faced the nullification crisis in South Carolina. South Carolina had said, we are going to use the force of the state to prevent the federal government from enforcing its own laws. And if the federal government tries to enforce them, we will secede.
Jackson believed deeply and indubitably in the power of union. If the Union had fallen apart, that would have been dishonoring his own blood family's sacrifices.
John C. Calhoun was, at best, a second-rate governmental theorist who created the blueprint for secession.
South Carolina joined the Union with the understanding that a state has a right of resistance to oppression or secession from the Union.
If I can judge from the signs of the times, nullification and secession, or in the language of truth, disunion, is gaining strength.
The clash of wills between Andrew Jackson and John C. Calhoun, and Jackson's clear willingness to resort to force in the last resort, reassured people that the government was not going to fall apart, the country was not going to fall apart.
The Union must be preserved. Disunion by armed force is treason.
For Jackson, this challenge cut to the core of the question of whether the United States was going to be a nation or not.
Without union, our independence and liberty would never have been achieved. Without union, they can never be maintained. Divide into 24 or even a smaller number of separate communities, and we shall see our sons made soldiers to deluge with blood the fields they now till in peace. The time at which I stand before you is full of interest. The eyes of all nations are fixed on our republic. The event of the existing crisis will be decisive in the opinion of mankind of the practicability of our federal system of government. Great is the stake placed in our hands. Great is the responsibility which must rest upon the people of the United States.
Jackson actually adopted a series of very carefully calibrated, very carefully controlled measures to meet nullification without violence.
The crisis was settled by a compromise in Congress.
He beat back the nullifiers. He gave us an extra 30 years to form bonds that would be tested so deeply and so tragically in the Civil War.
Jackson set a precedent for Lincoln and his contemporaries to insist on the preservation of the Union in 1860 and 61.
My public life has been a long one, and I cannot hope that it has at all times been free from errors.
Anyone who believes in democracy, anyone who believes in its future, has to grapple with Jackson.
We have now lived almost 50 years under the Constitution, framed by the sages and patriots of the Revolution.
Jackson was in the right place at the right time for the development of the American democracy. He was there at a moment that was very, very difficult.
We have had our seasons of peace and of war, with all the evils which precede or follow a state of hostility with powerful nations.
By the end of his term, Jackson had an economic philosophy, a social philosophy, a political program, which was coherent, enduring, and which no one would have predicted in 1828.
I leave this great people prosperous and happy in the full enjoyment of liberty and peace, and honored and respected by every nation of the world.
He brought more people into the political process than had been at any point in America's past. And so, if you want to find the beginnings of a democratic culture, you have to start with Jackson.
I thank God that my life has been spent in the land of liberty, and that He has given me a heart to love my country.
Thank you so much, Art. It's been quite a day here. We've had a serious history lesson of importance that I really think we need to remind our friends and neighbors that this video of the entire presentation will be up on the St. George's website for 4 weeks. And that for those that want to have their history improved on Jackson and appreciate fully more his life and what he did and what he overcame. We look at this big, beautiful building and we think, oh, he had it really good. Well, no, he didn't. He had a tough, tough life. Even when he became wealthy, it was a tough life. So we can learn from that. We can learn how people can come out of the lowest opportunities in life and succeed to the highest level. So thank you, Art, for doing this. We will see all of you all next month, and God bless us all.